October 12, 1944, somewhere along the Belgian-German border. The photograph was taken by Sergeant Harold Whitmore, a young American war correspondent whose camera often captured moments that soldiers tried to forget. In this frame, caught beneath a sagging canvas tent in a cold autumn rain, a German woman soldier sits on a wooden crate, her uniform soaked through, her hands trembling as she struggles with her boots. Kneeling in front of her is an American infantryman, mud dripping from his helmet, studying her with an expression that looks nothing like hatred. Just moments before the shutter clicked, the patrol that captured her had been ordered to bring her to the rear lines. But where exactly, and for what purpose? Why does the American appear to be helping her instead of guarding her? Why is she looking down? Not in defiance, but in something closer to exhaustion or shame. And why does the scene feel less like a moment between enemies and more like a moment between two human beings caught in the same storm? The rain is falling hard. The war is closing in. And somewhere beyond the edges of this photograph lies a truth more complicated than either army ever expected. What happened in the minutes after this picture was taken is the story you are about to hear. September 3, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The sun hung low and merciless, pouring its heat across the red dirt yard behind the medical hut. Dust shimmered in the air, and cicadas droned from the brush beyond the fence. In the center of that brightness, frozen in a single frame, stood 11 German women, thin, exhausted, their Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms faded from weeks of travel. Their boots lay scattered beside them like fallen shells. Bare feet pressed against the scorching Texas soil, toes curled instinctively against the heat. Corporal Edwin Cole, a farm boy from Nebraska turned Army photographer, raised his camera and captured the moment. He didn't know the image would survive the war or that historians would argue about it decades later. All he saw was a strange collision of worlds. German women lined up like schoolgirls at recess, and American soldiers kneeling before them, clipboard in hand. Two medics crouched low, one adjusting his spectacles, the other brushing the dirt aside to inspect a swollen arch that told its own story of marches, evacuations, and starvation. A UAC sergeant stood behind them, arms crossed, her shadow cutting sharply across the ground. She said something soft, almost gentle, before repeating it more clearly. "Ladies, show us your feet." The words drifted into the hot air, unexpected, almost absurd. Feet? Why feet? For the women, the phrase had landed like an electric current. They stiffened, glancing at each other with eyes full of panic. Some instinctively pulled their feet back as if bracing for humiliation or pain. Others stood rooted in place, too stunned to move. Their journey across the Atlantic had prepared them for many possibilities: starvation, forced labor, interrogation, even torture. But this, standing barefoot before enemy soldiers who seemed oddly polite, this made no sense at all. From the outside, the scene looked peaceful, almost ordinary. But inside each woman's chest, fear thrashed violently. Anna Weber, 22, the youngest radio operator in the group, squeezed her cloth bag so tightly the fabric dug into her palms. She felt the sun burning her shoulders, smelled the faint whiff of disinfectant from the infirmary, heard the rustle of paper as a medic flipped through forms. Everything felt wrong. The brightness, the calmness, the order. In Europe, calmness meant danger. In Germany, silence meant air raids. But here there was only the noise of Texas wind rolling over the plains and the creak of a distant windmill turning lazily above the barracks. No German prisoner had prepared her for this. She looked around the yard. The fences were tall but widely spaced, not the brutal steel she expected. Guard towers stood at the perimeter, but the soldiers lounging inside them didn't shout or crack rifle bolts for intimidation. Instead, one of them offered a half-wave to another guard walking past, as if the presence of enemy women was nothing more than a break in the day's routine. For the Germans, the normalcy was frightening. For the Americans, it was Tuesday. The medics moved down the line methodically. They worked with quiet professionalism, asking the women, through a translator, to lift their feet, flex their toes, or point out sores. The requests were clinical, not cruel, but the women's bodies flinched all the same. They had been told so many stories during their training, stories of American savagery, of humiliation, of the enemy's thirst for revenge, that the sight of a kneeling American soldier felt like the first step toward something darker. But instead of striking, the medic gently rotated Anna's ankle, inspecting a cracked heel. "You've been walking a long time," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Anna didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. Not contempt, not disgust, concern. She blinked, startled. Behind the row of women, a few American guards leaned against a truck, watching the inspection with bored familiarity. These men were from a generation that had grown up during the Great Depression. Farmhands, mill workers, sons of mechanics and coal miners. Hard years had carved discipline into their bones, but war had demanded something more from them, a kind of moral clarity that told them cruelty had no place in how they treated their prisoners. Their country believed strength wasn't just measured in steel and firepower, it was measured in restraint. By 1944, America was producing 96,000 aircraft a year, turning out ships faster than Germany could sink them. But perhaps its most powerful export was something far simpler: confidence. Not arrogance, not brutality. A quiet, unshakable confidence that allowed its soldiers to greet their enemies not with hatred, but with procedure. That confidence radiated through the yard that morning. The medic looked up at the wax sergeant. "This one's got blisters," he said, "probably from marching. Might need salve and new socks." "Put it in the report," she answered, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Make sure they're treated today." The order was delivered with the same tone she might use for American recruits. To her, the uniform didn't matter. The human body in front of her did. But the German women didn't know that yet. All they felt was the tension coiling tighter in their stomachs with every passing second. One whispered to another, her voice shaking. "What are they going to do to us?" Another shook her head. "They want us barefoot. It must be punishment." But an older woman, a former clerk from Bremen, exhaled slowly. "Look at their faces," she murmured. "They are not angry." The others hesitated, studying the Americans again. She was right. There was no malice, no relish, no cruelty. Only focus, only duty. The paradox unsettled them even more. When the wax sergeant called for the next woman in line, Anna stepped forward. She lifted her foot hesitantly, muscles trembling from both exhaustion and fear. The medic supported her heel with one hand and examined the cracked skin. He looked up briefly, offering a nod meant to reassure. Anna didn't know how to interpret it. Kindness had never been part of the stories she'd been told about America. As the inspection continued, the heat shimmered across the yard. A nearby flag snapped in the wind, its shadow sweeping across the dusty ground and over the bare feet of 11 women who had expected hatred, but instead found a kind of order they couldn't yet understand. For viewers today, the photograph seems almost gentle, but for the women living it, every second felt like standing at the edge of an unknown cliff. Why were enemy soldiers kneeling before them? Why did the Americans care about their injuries? Why did the inspection feel more like a doctor's visit than a humiliation? Shock lingered in the air, heavy as the Texas sun. Nothing about this moment matched the world they thought they knew. And for the first time since leaving Germany, a tiny, dangerous thought flickered inside them. What if everything they had been told about America was wrong? Long before Anna Weber stood barefoot on Texas soil, fear had already carved itself deep into her bones. It began months earlier in Germany, whispered through barracks, shouted in training halls, and repeated endlessly in the propaganda films shown before every deployment. Americans torture female prisoners. They experiment on them. Captured women disappear. Better to die on the front than fall into American hands. The words came from officers who spoke with cold authority, from radio broadcasts that crackled over loudspeakers during evening roll call, from pamphlets passed out before each unit was moved closer to Allied lines. Anna had heard the warnings first as rumor, then as fact, and finally as gospel. By the time her radio outpost collapsed during the retreat from Normandy, those warnings had become part of her survival instinct. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was armor. It was reflex. When American infantry overran their position near Rouen, Anna expected the end. She and the other auxiliaries had abandoned their post only minutes before. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sound of artillery faded behind them, until the road ahead disappeared into a fog of exhaustion. When soldiers surrounded them, voices sharp, rifles raised, Anna felt a strange calmness, the calmness of someone who no longer had choices. But instead of violence, the Americans ordered them into trucks. Instead of execution, they gave them water. Instead of assault, they handed out blankets. None of it made sense. Fear didn't go away. It simply hid beneath confusion. The journey across the Atlantic only deepened that confusion. The women were loaded onto a converted cargo ship along with hundreds of other prisoners, wounded infantrymen, captured clerks, Luftwaffe mechanics. The women were separated from the men and placed in a cramped, windowless compartment that smelled of steel, seawater, and sweat. For 6 weeks, the ship creaked through storms, darkness, and the vast unknown. The rumors flourished in the dark. One woman, Elise, whispered that Americans shipped prisoners to secret camps where they conducted medical experiments. Another insisted they would be paraded through cities as trophies, humiliated before strangers until they lost their sanity. A third said she had heard of a female POW who was beaten to death the moment she reached American soil. Anna tried to ignore them, but fear has a way of multiplying in confined spaces. On the rare days when the hatch was opened for air, she would gaze across the endless ocean and imagine the moment of arrival. Hands tearing at her, boots kicking her, guards shouting in English she wouldn't understand. She wrote a letter to her mother, but never sent it. It was a goodbye, disguised as reassurance. "If I do not return," she wrote, "know that I served with pride. Know that I did not surrender willingly." Several women around her wrote similar letters. One kept hers tucked inside a boot. Another rolled hers into a locket. They all imagined the same fate, and each imagined it with a kind of grim acceptance. No one believed they would survive America. Their fear grew heavier when they crossed the American coastline. From the deck, they saw factories stretching toward the horizon. Vast structures with chimneys that pumped smoke like endless columns. Trains moved in long metallic chains, hauling tanks and aircraft parts. On the docks, soldiers in clean uniform shouted orders without the desperation or exhaustion the Germans had seen in their own ranks. This was not a nation at war in the same way Germany was at war. This was a nation supplying the world. Anna realized with a jolt that America was not collapsing under shortages, not hollowed out by bombings, not starving in the streets. In Germany, ration cards offered 200 grams of meat per week if you were lucky. Bombed cities rotted under fallen stone and starvation. Families cooked thin soups over broken brick stoves. People scraped frost off windows for drinking water. But here the docks overflowed. Here the trains ran constantly. Here the soldiers stood tall, fed by an agricultural system vast enough to feed millions. Her fear did not diminish at this sight. It grew. A country this powerful did not need mercy. A country this confident did not need restraint. What would such a nation do to its enemies? When the women were placed onto trains heading southwest, fear became their only constant companion. The landscape changed slowly, from bustling industrial centers to wheat fields swaying endlessly in the wind. Then the earth grew flatter, harsher, redder. They entered Texas with dread knotted tightly in their stomachs. At Camp Hearn, the moment of disembarkation was suffocating. Bright sun, dust swirling around the truck wheels, American guards standing tall and silent. The sound of the gate clanging shut behind them. Anna felt as if she were stepping into the center of every nightmare she'd been told. The first command came quickly. "Take off your boots." The women froze. Boots were protection. Boots were dignity. Boots were the last piece of their identity as soldiers. Elise hissed under her breath. "They're checking if we can survive hard labor." Another muttered, "Dogs. They treat us like dogs." A third whispered with trembling lips, "This is the humiliation they warned us about." The guards didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply waited, watching with patient eyes. But patience was a language the women did not recognize. In their minds, the silence meant something terrible was coming. Punishment, degradation, the first step toward whatever the Americans truly planned. And then came the phrase from the WAC sergeant, "Show us your feet." The words snapped through them like a gunshot. Anna's heart thundered. She imagined being inspected like livestock, prodded, measured, deemed fit or unfit for labor. She imagined rows of American officers deciding who would be sent to mines, farms, or factories. She imagined her feet, blistered, cracked, swollen from weeks of marching, being used to judge her worth. Everything inside her recoiled. Everything inside her screamed, but she forced her boots off anyway, because she knew the alternative might be worse. Around her, panic rippled quietly. One woman's breath came in short gasps. Another gripped her skirt to stop her hands from shaking. A third kept whispering a prayer under her breath. Nothing about the scene was violent. Nothing involved weapons or shouting, and yet the terror was overwhelming. Fear does not need a gun to exist. Fear only needs memory. Memory of bombs falling on Hamburg. Memory of ration lines stretching around corners. Memory of commanders barking warnings that Americans had no mercy. Memory of bodies pulled from ruins. Memory of girls in uniform told they were expendable. So when American medics knelt in front of them, calm, focused, clipboard in hand, the moment twisted into something surreal and unbearable. It contradicted everything they knew and confirmed everything they feared. If these soldiers were so calm, if this country was so abundant, if this process was so orderly, what were they planning? Why were they being treated with such formality? Why did the inspection feel more clinical than cruel? If America followed rules even with its enemies, what did that say about the world Anna had been raised in? Her heart hammered harder, not just from terror, but from the first fragile crack forming in her world view. When the medic reached for her foot, she braced instinctively, her entire body tense. She didn't yet know that the purpose of the exam was simple: to prevent infection, treat sores, and comply with the Geneva Convention. She didn't yet know that the Americans weren't checking if she was healthy enough for punishment, but whether she needed medical care before anything else. All she knew was fear shaped by years of propaganda, by a collapsing homeland, by a belief that America was a monster. And standing barefoot on the burning Texas ground, she wondered how much of that belief would survive the next 24 hours. The truth revealed itself not with a dramatic speech or a sudden announcement, but with small, ordinary gestures so gentle, so procedural, so quietly humane that the German women could not understand them at first. The first clue came when the American medic examining Anna reached for a small tin from his field kit. He twisted it open with his thumb and index finger, releasing a smell both sharp and medicinal. He dabbed his fingertip into the white salve, then looked up at her with a brief, polite warning. "This might feel cold," he said softly. Anna didn't understand the words, but she felt the tone. Calm, reassuring, almost apologetic. She braced anyway. She expected pain, rough handling, some display of dominance. Instead, he lifted her foot as if it were something fragile. He supported her heel in the palm of his hand, spreading the ointment over the cracked skin with slow, deliberate motions. His brows drew together in concentration, not anger. The salve tingled as it sank into the sores that had hardened and split during the long march across France, the ocean crossing, and the final train ride to Texas. He murmured something again as he worked, not a threat, not a command, something closer to sympathy. Another medic moved down the line, repeating the process with the next woman. A third stood near a folding table, taking notes on each injury, occasionally asking the translator for clarification. Nothing in the scene matched the stories the women had been fed in Germany. No one shouted, no one mocked them, no one called them names. The Americans knelt while the prisoners stood. It was upside down, backward, impossible. One of the older POWs, Lotte, stared in disbelief as a medic wrapped clean gauze around her swollen ankle. His hands were steady and respectful, the kind of touch she hadn't felt since her mother tended scraped knees in childhood. She blinked hard to keep tears from forming. Another woman, Elise, winced when the medic pressed gently against a bruised tendon. He immediately pulled back. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. The translator hesitated, unsure how to convey the word ma'am. There was no perfect German equivalent. The closest was gnädige Frau, a phrase that belonged more to politeness than authority. But Elise didn't need translation. She heard the softness. Ma'am. She had not been addressed with dignity by anyone in uniform, not German, not Allied, for years. In Germany, soldiers barked orders, officers snapped, medical staff swore and threatened. Even civilian doctors treated women with indifference, their exhaustion visible from years of shortages and bombings. And yet here, in a prisoner-of-war camp on the other side of the world, an American soldier apologized to her. When the medic asked again, slower, enunciating carefully, "Does this hurt, ma'am?" Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to answer. She didn't even know how to interpret the question. The medic interpreted her silence as confusion. He gestured gently, pressing one spot on her foot, then another, waiting for her reaction. She nodded at the second, and he adjusted his treatment accordingly. Behind them, one of the guards leaned his rifle casually against the fence, lowering himself to help another medic unroll a spool of bandages. The guard wasn't ordered to help. He did it because he saw the medics needed another pair of hands. He knelt, too, without ceremony, without hesitation. The German women stared. This was not humiliation. This was not cruelty. This was not a test for suffering. This was a medical inspection, thorough, regulated, almost gentle. And slowly, painfully, the truth dawned. The Americans were following rules. Real rules. Geneva Convention rules. Rules they honored even when the enemy was a young woman who had once helped guide Luftwaffe pilots toward American targets. Anna swallowed hard as the medic finished wrapping her foot. He cut the bandage neatly, secured it, then looked up with the same mild expression she had seen ranchers give to injured animals in the German countryside. "There," he said, patting the top of her foot lightly. "You're good." She stared at him as if he were speaking from another universe. Because he was. He came from a world where medical supplies weren't rationed to the last thread, where soap wasn't a luxury, where factories still produced gauze and antiseptics in such abundance that even prisoners received them. He came from a country that wasn't starving. In Germany, clinics were overwhelmed, their shelves bare. Nurses no longer cleaned wounds gently. They pressed hard to save time. Supplies were reserved for soldiers still capable of fighting. Civilians were left to improvise with scraps of cloth, salt water, or nothing at all. Here, in Texas, a medic used fresh gauze on a German foot without hesitation. Another medic passed out small packets of powder for fungal infections. Fungal infections that had ravaged European troops for years, untreated, worsening in trenches, barracks, and frozen roadsides. Another asked a woman to wiggle her toes to check circulation, waiting patiently as she did so, nodding approvingly. Another made a joke, something about hot Texas ground cooking their feet, and though the women didn't understand his words, they recognized kindness in his smile. The contradiction was overwhelming. And then came the biggest shock of all. The wax sergeant stepped forward and motioned for the women to sit on the wooden bench by the infirmary wall. Her voice, clipped and efficient, carried authority, but not cruelty. Through the translator, she explained, "The foot inspection is required. It is for your health. If you have wounds, we treat them. If you have infections, we prevent them from spreading." The women exchanged stunned looks. Required? For their health? American soldiers caring about German prisoners? Before they could process it, a new sound echoed through the yard, the door of the supply hut creaking open. 2 American soldiers emerged carrying a crate. They placed it on the ground and pried off the lid. Inside were socks, clean, thick, gray cotton socks. Not German military socks, thin and patched, not the stiff wool ones that caused rashes, not civilian socks made from recycled fabric. New socks. The soldiers began distributing them, handing each pair over as if this were the most normal thing in the world. One by one, the German women held the socks in their hands, disbelieving. "You will receive 2 pairs each week," the sergeant said. 2 pairs a week. Back home, a pair of socks could last 2 winters if you were fortunate. Here, prisoners were being issued replacements regularly. It was too much. Anna felt her throat tighten. She pressed the soft cotton against her palm and stared at a medic reapplying salve to another woman's heel. This wasn't humiliation. This wasn't preparation for torture. This wasn't labor conditioning. This was care. This was protection. This was mercy. For a moment, she forgot the dusty yard, the guards, the heat. She saw instead the bombed-out streets of Hamburg, where children limped barefoot, through rubble because shoes were a luxury. She remembered her mother crying over a pair of socks too worn to mend again. She remembered days when the world seemed to shrink into hunger and fear. Now, an American soldier was giving her socks without hesitation. Why? Why would a country give such comfort to its enemies? Why would a medic kneel before a prisoner? Why would a sergeant speak respectfully to women she had every reason to despise? A question spread quietly, almost painfully, among the women. Why do they care about our feet? The answer was not dramatic, but it was profound. Because America could afford to. Because America followed rules. Because America believed in a different kind of strength. A strength rooted not in fear, but in confidence. A strength that didn't need brutality to assert itself. Farm boys from Iowa, Kansas, and Oklahoma, boys raised on church virtues and Depression-era hardship, were now the caretakers of the very people whose nation had bombed their ships and targeted their pilots. And they did it without hesitation. One of the medics, a young man with sandy hair, checked Anna's bandage again before she stepped away. He looked up at her, offering a half-smile that reached his eyes. "You take care now, ma'am," he said gently. The word echoed inside her like a foreign blessing. Ma'am, not enemy, not prisoner, not German. Ma'am, a human being. For the first time since leaving Germany, something warm flickered beneath Anna's fear, something she didn't yet have a name for. It felt like the beginning of a collapse, but not the destructive kind. A moral collapse, a collapse of certainty, a collapse of everything she had believed about the enemy. The truth behind "show us your feet" was simple, almost unbearably simple. The Americans were making sure the prisoners were healthy. The truth beneath that truth was even more staggering. They cared, not because they needed to, not because anyone was watching, not because these women deserved it, but because caring was what their country had taught them to do. In that moment, standing barefoot with clean socks in hand and fresh bandages around her wounds, Anna Weber experienced something more shocking than fear. Kindness. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It moved through the group of German women like a slow, unstoppable tide. One that began with a single tear and ended in the quiet collapse of everything they thought they knew. It started with Lotte. She was the oldest among them, 35, her face lined not by age but by years of rationing, fear, and the constant strain of survival. She had marched with them through France. She had slept on the ship's cold metal floor. She had kept the others calm when storms slammed against the hull at night. She had not cried once since the day she put on a Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. Until now, when the American medic brought out a basin of warm water and gently eased her, foot into it, she gasped, not from pain, but from shock. The warmth spread across her skin, seeping into cuts and calluses, loosening dirt that had been pressed into her soles for weeks. For the first time since she stepped onto the ship bound for America, she felt something soften inside her. Warm water, clean water. Water heated not for a soldier or officer, but for a prisoner. The medic lowered her foot into the basin more fully and looked up to ask, "Too hot, ma'am." The word "ma'am" was the final blow. The tears came suddenly, first a choked sound, then a sob that broke open years of silence. Lotte covered her mouth with her hand, but the tears spilled between her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered in German, as if apologizing for losing control. "I'm sorry. I can't." The medic froze for a moment, startled, then instinctively reached for a towel. "It's okay," he said quietly, unsure if she understood. "You're okay." But she wasn't okay. None of them were. The women watched as Lotta hid her face in her hands and cried into her knees. They watched the medic kneel beside her, gently patting her shoulder, not knowing what else to do. And with each sob Lotta released, something inside the entire group seemed to unravel. Because no one cried like that over warm water, not unless they had been starved of comfort for far too long. Anna felt her own eyes sting. She tried to look away, but another shock washed over her. Elise, who had always spoken the loudest against Americans, was trembling as she pulled on her new socks. The cotton was soft, thick, almost luxurious. She had not felt anything like it since before the war. When Germany rationed wool and cotton, civilian socks were made from recycled fibers that frayed after a few uses. Most women in Germany patched their socks until nothing was left but holes stitched together. Here, an American guard had tossed her a fresh pair as casually as if handing out candy. She pressed the socks to her face. They smelled faintly of laundry soap. And she began to shake. Another whisper cut through the air. It came from a timid girl barely 20, Duitze, the youngest of the auxiliaries captured with them. "In Germany," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Not even civilians get treatment like this anymore." No one answered. No one could, because every woman in that yard knew it was true. They had seen Germany collapse. They had seen cities crumble into ash. They had seen families boil weeds for soup. They had seen fathers shrink from hunger. Mothers trade wedding rings for potatoes. Children die from infections a spoonful of penicillin could have cured, if Germany still had penicillin at all. And now here they were, in the hands of the enemy, receiving medical care more tender and more abundant than what their own nation could provide its own people. The shame of that truth landed like a blow. One by one the memories came back. The ration lines, the bombed pharmacies, the hospitals overcrowded with the wounded and starving, the doctors who snapped at patients because they no longer had anything to give. Anna remembered her father standing in line for hours hoping to buy a bit of meat. She remembered the cold winter when frostbite spread through her neighborhood like an invisible plague, when people wrapped their feet in newspaper because Germany had run out of wool. She remembered hearing about a woman who died because she couldn't find a doctor willing or able to treat her infected foot. Here, prisoners were being treated before they had even asked. The medic moved to Anna again, checking her bandage. His hands were steady, sure, and gentle. Something inside her rebelled against the feeling, not because it hurt, but because it felt wrong to be cared for like this by the enemy. She didn't know where to look. She didn't know how to breathe. She didn't know how to reconcile the world she had been raised in with the world she was experiencing now. Her thoughts tangled, collided, collapsed in on themselves. Why kindness? Why to them? Why the respect, the apologies, the warm water? Why did Americans treat prisoners better than Germany treated its own civilians? Her mind raced with the contradictions. Americans were monsters. Yet here a medic kneeled before her. Americans were brutes. Yet here a soldier apologized for hurting her. Americans were cruel. Yet here she was being given clean socks. Americans were savages. Yet there was nothing savage about the hands tending her wounds. A single question rose above the chaos in her mind, steady and painful. What if everything was a lie? Her breathing grew shallow. Her heartbeat quickened. The medic noticed and paused. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked softly. The word ma'am again. It pushed her over the edge. Something broke inside her. Not violently, but quietly, like a thread snapping after holding too much weight for too long. Anna leaned forward, her hands trembling, and the only English words she could gather slipped from her lips in a cracked whisper. "Why? Why are you kind?" The medic blinked. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply held her gaze, seeing the confusion, the fear, the exhaustion in her eyes. He had seen that look before. In Europe, in children fleeing bombed villages, in soldiers too injured to keep fighting, in civilians who had lost everything. But he had never seen it in an enemy who expected cruelty and instead received care. He exhaled slowly. Then he answered with a simplicity that belonged not to protocol or politics, but to human decency. "Ma'am," he said gently, "because it's the right thing to do." Anna didn't understand all the words, but she understood the meaning. It crushed her. Her face crumpled. Tears she hadn't shed in years spilled down her cheeks. She lowered her head, shoulders shaking in silent sobs. The medic hesitated, only a moment before placing a hand on her arm. A cautious gesture, respectful, offering comfort without presuming closeness. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now." Safe. A word she had not felt in years, a word she had never expected to hear from the mouth of an American. Around her, the emotional collapse spread. One woman sobbed openly, covering her face. Another sank onto the bench, her body shaking. A third whispered in disbelief. Why? 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 Not why the Americans were doing this, but why they had never been told the truth. Why their leaders lied. Why they had believed hatred so easily. Why mercy struck harder than cruelty ever could. The Americans didn't fully understand what they were witnessing. They saw tears, trembling, shock, symptoms of exhaustion, hunger, fear. They tried to help as best they could. A guard brought water, a medic fetched extra towels, another offered a seat in the shade. Small gestures, sincere gestures, not realizing that every gesture was dismantling an entire worldview. At the far end of the yard, a woman named Margaret pressed her forehead against her knees and whispered, "My God, they are treating us better than Germany treats Germans." And she was right. The German women had expected brutality. They had expected hunger. They had expected punishment. They had not expected decency. They had not expected dignity. They had not expected to be treated as human. The Americans didn't know that their simple kindness was breaking these women down more effectively than any interrogation ever could. They didn't know that this was the first moment the POWs began questioning the ideology they had lived under since childhood. They didn't know that mercy could wound deeper than cruelty. As the sun lowered over Camp Hearn, the medics finished their examinations. The women sat together in silence, their feet bandaged, their socks clean, their hearts shattered. For the Americans, it was just another day. For the German women, it was the day their world cracked open. Somewhere in that yard, something fundamental shifted, something irreversible. The fear that had defined them loosened, the hatred they had been taught dimmed, and the idea of America, immoral, monstrous, brutal, crumbled entirely. They didn't know what would come next, but they knew one thing for certain. Kindness had undone them, and nothing in their lives would ever be the same. For the first time since their capture, the German women slept without trembling. The infirmary lights had dimmed, the Texas wind cooled, and the camp settled into its quiet nightly rhythm. Footsteps on gravel, murmurs from the guard towers, the muted clang of a distant gate. The women lay on their bunks, bandaged feet resting on clean sheets, socks folded neatly beside them. But none of them slept easily. Their bodies rested. Their minds did not. Because everything they believed about America had begun to crack open, slowly, painfully, irreversibly. Anna stared up at the wooden rafters overhead, unable to shake the memory of the medic's gentle voice. "Ma'am. Because it's the right thing to do." She replayed it again and again, each time feeling the sting of shame mixed with something softer, something she had not felt in years. Trust. And she wasn't alone. Around her, the women whispered in the dark, their voices hushed not out of fear of punishment but out of confusion, humility, and the dawning realization that they had been wrong. Tragically wrong. Lotta murmured, "They do not hate us." Elise whispered back, "I don't understand it." Duitza added, "Why show kindness to those who would not show it in return?" No one had an answer. Not yet. What they did have was the memory of American hands, steady, respectful, lifting their injured feet, wrapping bandages, offering socks and apologies. Hands that had no reason to be gentle. Hands that belonged to the very enemy they had feared for years. And slowly, the truth emerged. The Americans did not see them as monsters. They did not see them as threats. They saw them as human. The realization was both comforting and devastating. They began to notice America. In the days that followed, the women moved around Camp Hearn with new eyes. Fear no longer blinded them. Kindness had opened something inside. They began to observe. America revealed itself not through speeches or propaganda, but through daily life. Simple, quiet, unpretentious. The guards spoke to each other with an ease the women had never seen among German soldiers. There was no rigid hierarchy dictating every movement, no officer barking threats, no fear in their voices. Even the youngest privates carried themselves with a confidence that felt foreign. It was the confidence of men raised not on ideology but on stability, on abundance, on the belief that strength did not require cruelty. Anna noticed how the guards treated each other, fairly, jokingly, like brothers. She noticed the way disputes were handled, calmly, privately, without the raging tempers so common in German barracks. She noticed the way American soldiers would stop to help one another with chores, repairs, or patrols without waiting for orders. It was the opposite of everything she'd known. One afternoon, while sweeping the infirmary entrance, she watched two guards playfully argue about baseball. Another group passed by carrying lumber for a new shed, laughing as they worked. A sergeant scolded a private, not with threats, not with humiliation, but with a firm, fatherly tone that ended with a pat on the shoulder and a quiet, "Do better tomorrow." Fairness, calmness, confidence, and underneath it all, a moral structure she could feel even without understanding the words. We do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Back home, Germany preached discipline and order, but beneath that surface lay fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of questioning orders, fear of ideology that punished weakness. Here, there was no fear. Here even the enemy walked with heads unbowed. America's moral strategy and its unexpected consequence. In time, the women learned from interpreters and notices posted in camp that the medical inspections, the clean socks, the respectful treatment, none of it was accidental. It was policy. The United States had made a deliberate choice. Humanity was a strategy. Prisoners treated well gave less resistance. Prisoners with full stomachs didn't attempt desperate escapes. Decent conditions encouraged more Germans to surrender on the battlefield. What Germany saw as weakness, this American softness, was in fact a tactical advantage of staggering efficiency. Anna read a bulletin translated into German. The United States follows the Geneva Convention. Violations will not be tolerated. Not tolerated. The phrasing stunned her. In Germany, violations of decency were expected. Here, they were forbidden. And the strangest part? The Americans didn't boast about it. They didn't lecture the prisoners. They simply lived it. The more the German women observed, the deeper the wound became, not the wound on their feet, but the wound in their pride, because the uncomfortable truth hung heavily over them. The enemy has more humanity than the country we served. It was a truth they could barely speak aloud, a truth that made their hands tremble as they wrote letters home, a truth that turned their stomachs when they recalled the propaganda films, the classroom lectures, the officers promising glorious victory. If Germany had been right, why were the Americans kind? If America was the monster, why did its soldiers kneel? A slow, painful metamorphosis began to take shape, a transformation from blind loyalty to sober clarity. The greatest generation reveals itself. The more time passed, the more the women saw patterns, consistent, unmistakable patterns. It wasn't just the medics or the whack sergeant who treated them well. It was everyone. The cooks who served them full plates, the guards who allowed them shade on hot days, the chaplain who spoke to them with gentleness, even through a translator, the Red Cross workers who checked on their well-being as if they were citizens, not enemies. These weren't isolated acts of kindness. This was a culture. America's greatest generation had been shaped by the Great Depression, years of struggle, hunger, and resilience. But instead of emerging hardened and cruel, they emerged disciplined and compassionate. They believed in helping the helpless because they had once been helpless themselves. They believed in fairness because they understood suffering. The women saw it everywhere. They saw it in the guard who took extra time to help a prisoner read an English phrase. They saw it in the soldier who fixed a prisoner's broken shoelace. They saw it in the doctor who insisted every injured foot be treated. No matter how minor. Anna listened as two guards spoke while cleaning their rifles near the barracks. "War don't give you an excuse to forget you're human," one said. "Or to forget they are," the other replied. The words lingered in Anna's mind long after the conversation ended. They came from men who had lost brothers, cousins, neighbors, friends, men who had watched Americans die in France and the Pacific. Men who could have justified hatred, but didn't. It was not weakness. It was strength unlike any she had known. The transformation. Slowly, subtly, the women changed, not out of obligation, not out of manipulation, but because kindness has a way of eroding walls that brutality only hardens. Anna began returning greetings when a guard tipped his hat. Lotta helped a medic carry supplies without being asked. Elise, once defiant, thanked a nurse for the salve that eased her pain. Duitza practiced English words at night, whispering them like prayers. They were no longer reacting to America. They were learning from it. They began questioning the past, their leaders, their beliefs, their indoctrination. They began wondering whether the world they had defended was ever worthy of their loyalty. One afternoon, while sitting outside the infirmary with her bandaged feet resting on a wooden step, Anna watched two American soldiers repair a fence. They joked as they worked, teasing each other with the ease of lifelong friends. When one of them hammered his thumb and swore, the other burst into laughter. There was something beautiful in the simplicity of it. No propaganda, no fear, no ideology pressing down on every decision. Just men doing a job with dignity, humor, and pride. She felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been there since childhood, pulled tighter by every speech, every slogan, every film. It loosened because what she had been taught no longer matched what she saw, and then it dissolved entirely. Not in a dramatic moment, not in tears, but in quiet certainty. America was not perfect, but it was good, and goodness, she realized, was stronger than perfection. She looked around at the camp, the barracks, the guard towers, the medics, the dusty yard where her worldview had first begun to crack, and she understood what the others were beginning to accept. We feared the wrong things. They had feared American cruelty. Instead, they found American morality. They had feared American power. Instead, they found American restraint. They had feared American hatred. Instead, they found American decency. And in that realization, a new kind of fear emerged, a fear of what Germany had made of them, a fear of what they had supported, a fear of how deeply they had been deceived. But intertwined with that fear was something brighter: gratitude, admiration, awakening. For the first time, Anna felt the weight of her own transformation, a shift from enemy to observer, from observer to student, from student to something more complicated, something like respect, something like hope. And as the Texas sun dipped low over Camp Hearn, casting long shadows across the yard, the German women sat together in silence, absorbing the truth that had changed them. America had defeated them not just with bombs and bullets, but with humanity. They had lost a war, but in losing, they had gained something no victory could have given them: a moral awakening. As the days passed, the atmosphere inside Camp Hearn changed in ways the German women could never have imagined during their journey across the Atlantic. The fear that once sat like a stone in their stomachs slowly loosened. Suspicion faded, and in its place grew a cautious curiosity, then genuine observation. What they saw was not the America described in Nazi propaganda, but the real America of 1944. A country abundant in food, land, and confidence. A country where even enemy prisoners were treated with dignity. A country that, to them, felt almost impossibly decent. Anna noticed it first. She would sweep the walkway outside the infirmary and watch the guards during their breaks. They gathered near the yard with a worn baseball bat and a battered leather glove, laughing as one of them pitched slow balls to a small circle of soldiers waiting to hit. The sound of the ball cracking against wood echoed through the camp, followed by cheers, jeers, and playful arguments. No one shouted at the German women. No one watched them with hatred. No one treated them as though they deserved to suffer. Instead, the Americans moved around them with the easy familiarity of men raised in a society untouched by devastation. They joked as they passed each other, argued about baseball teams from New York and Chicago, swapped stories about farms in Kansas, coal towns in Pennsylvania, or fishing trips in Minnesota. They were young, they were alive, and they acted like neighbors, not conquerors. One afternoon, a guard named Private Wilson waved politely to Anna as he carried buckets of water to horses at the far end of camp. Another day, Sergeant O'Reilly carried extra firewood to the POW barracks because a cold front was coming. When one of the German women dropped a tin cup, a guard stooped to pick it up and simply handed it back with a nod. The German women had braced for cruelty. Instead, they witnessed courtesy. The simplicity of it disarmed them. They watched the Americans line up in the mess hall for meals that would have fed a German family for weeks. Eggs, bacon, bread, butter, fresh vegetables, served casually without fanfare. On Sundays, the guards walked to the small chapel near the administrative building, hats pressed to their chests, singing hymns with the steady, unembarrassed voices of people grounded in faith. In Germany, the war had stripped faith away from civilians. But here, faith flourished. The women marveled at how Americans spoke openly about family. Wives writing letters from Ohio, Brothers fighting. In the Pacific, mothers worrying back home. Even the guards who knew loss carried it differently. They grieved, but they did not let grief turn to bitterness. They held on to hope the way Germans held on to fear. The contrast was overwhelming. Camp Hearn, despite the barbed wire and guard towers, felt more humane than Germany's own streets had felt in years. And the most astonishing part? The Americans did not even seem aware of how remarkable they were. They handed out blankets simply because it was cold. They doubled breakfast portions after long work days because it felt fair. They let prisoners rest when sick because it was the right thing to do. To the German women, these gestures were revelations. To the Americans, they were routine. It slowly dawned on Anna that she was not simply observing a camp. She was observing a culture. And that culture was built on values her homeland had lost long before she was born. America, in 1944, was wealthy, yes, fuel, steel, cattle, crops, but it was wealthy in something deeper: unity, moral clarity, a shared belief in right and wrong, a conviction that even war did not justify abandoning decency. This America believed in the power of fairness and in the dignity of work. Its citizens had endured the Great Depression together and emerged not resentful or fractured, but more determined to protect the vulnerable and support the weak. It was a country that believed strength came from lifting others up, not grinding them down. And the German women felt this truth in every interaction. One evening, as the sun sank behind the guard towers and the sky burned orange over the Texas plains, Anna sat with Lotta on a wooden bench near the laundry hut. They watched a group of guards tossing a baseball back and forth, laughing loudly, the sound drifting across the dry air. "They don't hate us," Lotta said quietly, almost in disbelief. Anna nodded. "No, they don't." Lotta swallowed. "Why did we grow up believing they wanted to destroy us?" Anna didn't answer. Because the truth was too painful. They had been raised to fear a phantom America, an America that never existed. The real America stood before them in dusty boots and rolled-up sleeves, joking about minor league teams and debating which state had the best pie. And somewhere else, beyond the fences, across oceans, decades into the future, people who would one day hear these stories would feel something rise in their chests. A longing, a nostalgia, a quiet ache for a country that once felt simpler, kinder, more united. A country where strangers tipped their hats and neighbors trusted one another. A country where, even at war, Americans could look at an enemy and still see a human being. That was the America my grandpa grew up in, many would say. The one we've lost. Because today, America argues about everything. Politics, identity, blame, division. It fills the airwaves and fractures communities. But in 1944, deep in the heart of Texas, even prisoners, German prisoners, were treated with fairness and respect. And the descendants of those prisoners would one day write in the comments of videos like yours, "America saved my grandfather's life." My grandmother never forgot the kindness she received in the camp. They came home and taught us to respect America. We owe this country everything. For the German women inside Camp Hearn, the realization was slower, quieter, more intimate. It unfolded not in grand speeches but in simple observations. The way Americans shared food, the way they laughed easily, the way they trusted one another, the way they followed rules even when no one was watching, the way kindness was effortless, not strategic, the way America seemed to carry its morality not as a burden, but as a birthright. As Anna watched the guards pass the baseball again under the fading light, she felt that now familiar shift in her chest. the same one she had felt when the medic called her ma'am. She wasn't just witnessing a different country. She was witnessing a different way of being human. And for the first time in her life, she wondered, quietly, painfully, what happened to the world that raised me to fear this? What happened to the Germany that promised strength but delivered ruin? And deeper still, what happened to the America that lived like this, so confident it could afford to be kind? She didn't know the answer. Neither do we. But standing in that Texas twilight, surrounded by the unexpected gentleness of a nation at war, Anna understood one thing with absolute clarity. If mercy could exist even here, between enemies, then maybe mercy was the most powerful weapon America ever had. When the war finally ended, Camp Hearn began to empty. One transport after another carried prisoners back across the Atlantic, back toward a homeland they no longer recognized, back toward ruined cities, broken families, and the complicated silence that follows defeat. The German women lined up along the same dusty yard where weeks earlier they had stood trembling, barefoot, unsure if they would live to see another day. Now their feet were wrapped in sturdy American socks, soft, clean, neatly folded above their ankles. Their wounds had healed. The pain had faded, but something far deeper had changed. This time, when the American guards opened the gate, no fear followed, only gratitude. Anna stepped onto the truck holding a small cloth bag containing all she owned. Inside were simple things: 2 pairs of American socks, a tin of antifungal cream, a few Red Cross coupons she kept as souvenirs, and a small notebook filled with English words she had learned from the medics. Water, help, safe. Thank you. She also carried something that did not fit in her bag, a story no one in Germany would believe, a story so gentle it felt fragile. As the truck rumbled away from Camp Hearn for the last time, Anna turned back. She saw the guard tower, the barracks roofs catching the morning sun, the small chapel where hymns drifted across the yard on Sundays. She saw the medics who raised their hands in quiet farewell. She pressed a hand to her chest. America did not just heal our feet, she would later write in her journal. America healed our hatred. Germany was unrecognizable when they returned, cities flattened, rail lines twisted, homes burned to skeletal frames, families scattered or gone. But the women carried something rare into that devastation: hope born not of victory, but of mercy. When neighbors asked what America had been like, the women hesitated, unsure how much truth a wounded nation could bear. Was it too soon to tell them the enemy had saved their lives? Was it too soon to say kindness had come from across an ocean? Still, in kitchens rebuilt from rubble and cellars still smelling of smoke, the stories began spreading quietly. We survived because America showed mercy. They treated us better than Germany treated its own people. They gave us socks, medicine, real food. They spoke to us with respect, even when we were prisoners. Fathers wept hearing their daughters had been safe in enemy hands. Mothers crossed themselves in disbelief. Some men grew defensive, struggling to reconcile pride with truth. But the women didn't argue. They simply told their stories. And in time, those stories turned into something profound. A family legend passed from mother to child, from child to grandchild. Decades later, when Germany rebuilt itself and peace became a way of life, a few former POWs returned to America. Not as prisoners, but as visitors. Some traveled to Texas, searching for the places where kindness had changed them. They walked along the empty fields where the barracks once stood. They touched the foundations of Camp Hearn, now cracked and faded. Some carried flowers, some carried letters. One carried the same pair of American socks she had saved for 50 years. A few sought out the families of the medics who had tended their feet. They knocked on doors in Kansas, Oklahoma, or Nebraska, introducing themselves in careful English. "My name is Anna," one would say. "Your grandfather helped me when I was a prisoner. I've come to thank you." And in living rooms across America, tears were shed for a war that ended generations earlier, but whose kindness still lived. Later, when the internet connected distant lives, the descendants of those German POWs found your stories and left comments beneath them. "America saved my grandfather's life. My grandmother always said the guards treated her better than the Nazis ever did. She raised us to love America because America showed her mercy. We owe everything to the country that treated our family with dignity." What remains today of that moment in 1944 is not the camp, or the fences, or the guard towers. Those vanished long ago. What remains is the legacy. The memory of a country strong enough to be kind, a nation that believed morality was as essential as steel, as powerful as factories, as necessary as victory. A nation that understood mercy was not a weakness, but the ultimate proof of strength. And so the story closes not with gunfire or surrender, but with something quieter, softer, and infinitely more enduring. A pair of German feet, bandaged, cleaned, cared for, standing on Texas soil, a medic kneeling in the dust, a prisoner learning that the enemy was human, an enemy learning that mercy can break hatred, a future being rewritten before anyone realized it. America once carried that kind of moral weight, and the whisper from the past reaches us even now. America used to be strong, not only with steel, but with kindness. If we showed compassion in war, we can show compassion today. The greatest generation built a country so moral even enemies cried from kindness. The image of those bandaged feet fades, slowly, softly, into the rippling fabric of an American flag lifting in the wind, and the legacy lives on.